Let's start. Hi developers! In this video I'll explain to you the basics of the CI/CD pipelines in DevOps. Those are the continuous integration and continuous deployment. We talk about those pipelines when we want to automate and create a process where the build and the release of the application will be fully automated. So let's start with our developers who are developing the application. So we'll take here the sample of a web application that connects to a database. Then we'll go from the source code, enter the deployment of the application, and we'll explore those two pipelines, the CI and CD, in order to get the application deployed from the source code. So at first we'll have our developers writing the application on their laptops. So we'll have here so they will be writing the source code files, and here they have the source code for their applications. And then so here we'll have in our team we'll have those developers. The developers then, in order to share their application source code, they will use a source control management like GitHub, for example. So they will commit or push their code into an SCM system. So here we'll have an SCM. This could be anything Git. This could be either GitHub, GitLab, Azure repo, or it could be also Bitbucket. So the code will live in this source control management. This is essential in order to start creating the CI pipeline or the build. So from the source code management, we'll take the application's source code, then we'll go to the next step, which is the build. So from here, we'll have our build pipeline. And during the build pipeline, the goal here is to compile the applications, to generate a package for the application. So let's say here, the goal is to compile the app. This will run the command npm package install or .NET build, or any command depending on the programming language that we use in order to generate the package. So once we have generated that package, let's say here, this is the output of the build is the applications package. This could be .dll file or .jar or depends on the framework we are using. So the output of the build is this package. Then during the release pipeline, from here, the goal is to deploy the application. So during the release, we say here we'll go to deploy the app. And here deploying the app for a web application means we'll deploy the app into a web server, for example. So we'll go here to say we want to deploy to app production, for example. So we'll have an environment, a production environment, where we want to deploy the app. So this is the basics of the CI and CD pipelines, the basics of the DevOps implementation. But maybe we want to add more steps here in order to make sure that this package that we want to deploy doesn't have bugs and doesn't have anomalies. For that here, it would be great if I could run my unit tests during the build pipeline. So during the build, I'll add another step, which is running my unit tests. I can add another step in addition to make sure my package is good and is ready to be deployed. Maybe I want to run a static code analysis for my source code. So here I might run those static code analysis. And here maybe I want to use something like Sonar Cube, for example. So this makes sure my package is ready to be deployed. When we deploy that package into the release, maybe here I need to make sure that before deploying to production, the package is ready, or I want to make more tests before deploying to production. And here, where we can use, for example, some other environments like the test environment. So this could be your UAT, user acceptance tests, QA for quality assurance, and many more. And maybe even before running those or before deploying the package into test to make it available for my beta testers, maybe I want to make it available for my intern developers. I want the PO and the other developers to be able to deploy the application and see it running successfully before giving it to my external testers. So here, maybe you have another environment, which is the dev environment. And the difference here between the dev and the test is that the dev is more restricted than the test. In dev, I have many, about, let's say, 10, 20 users who will test the application in the dev environment. Then, once they validate the application in dev, we'll move to deploy the application in the test environment, and we'll give it to 100 user, 1000, or even 10,000 users, and they will be able to test it like in beta program. Then, if the test environment was the tests are validated, then we can go to production. So here, maybe also during the release pipeline, and in addition to those different environments, I want to I have some integration tests. So I can run those from here. Maybe also I want to run more tests like the UAT tests or the UI tests. So maybe I want to run some manual QA tests. My QA engineers will want to test the application in the test environment. So here what I have done is that I have added more tests and more checks in order to make sure my app builds successfully, it generates a good package, and that package will be deployed to different environments before going to the production. So if we go back then here to this section here we mentioned only developers, but we know that DevOps is about making the developers and my IT pro and my DBA, all of them, they should work together. So it doesn't make sense to only mention the developers here. So let's start adding the DBA, because my application, maybe it have a database. So for the database scripts, they will be written by the DBA in most of the cases. So we need to add the DBA to this loop here. So let's go here to add our DBA. I'll use another color. Our database administrator, he will be working on the SQL scripts. And the best of the cases is that he will put his scripts inside the same Git repository used by the developers. So his scripts will live here. Then during the build, maybe if he's using something like SQL Server Management Studio, SSMS, and he's using the database projects, then he won't manipulate directly the SQL scripts, but he needs to compile this database project in order to generate those scripts. So during the build pipeline, we'll add another step for compiling the database project. So from here, we say the goal here is to generate the scripts. And in addition to generating the scripts, maybe we want to add more tests in order to make sure those scripts, their syntax is correct. So let's say here, generate the SQL scripts. And in addition to that, we want to make more testing the scripts. Then during the release pipeline, so those scripts will be passed from the build to the release pipeline through the artifact. And inside the release pipeline, what we want to do here, as we have deployed the application into the web server, we want to deploy those SQL scripts into our database. So we'll add another step here in the release pipeline, which will be deploying the SQL scripts. The SQL scripts into the database. And maybe here I have also more tests I want to run. Maybe if I'm using SQL Server, then I want to run my SQL T. Those are unit tests to test the storage procedure in my database. Maybe I want to run those during the release pipeline. And here the integration tests and the UI and QA tests, they will validate not only the application, but they will also validate the schema for the database. So my database tests will be covered by the integration and UI tests. And the same for the database. For each of those different environments, we'll have a web app. We have a different web app and a different database. So in production, we'll have web app here plus DB for the production environment. And the same here, we'll have web plus DB, and the same for dev. So that we can make sure we have those different environments are isolated. So we have talked about the developers, the DBA. Now we still need to add a third one here, who are the IT Pro. So let's add those. I'll use again different color. IT Pro or the Ops, because DevOps is about the developers and the Ops. So we need to add those into this different pipelines. The IT Pro will care about the infrastructure that will run the application. They will care about this web app, the database, and maybe if I'm using some other components, the load balancers, virtual machines. So they will care about provisioning those resources, and they will make sure that the app will fit inside the created infrastructure. So the IT Pro, as the developers and the DBA, they'll have their own source code files. Here maybe they are using some tools like Terraform, for example, which could be used in order to provision infrastructure, and maybe they could also use ARM templates, Azure Resource Manager, in order to provision resources on Azure. If they are using Amazon, maybe they are using CloudFormation. So each cloud provider has its own technology in order to provision and maintain the infrastructure. So they'll have their source code files. Luckily, if we are lucky enough, they will put those files inside the source code management. So we'll have the application source code, the SQL scripts, and also the infrastructure files. And during the build pipeline, maybe here we want to make sure or to validate those files. For Terraform, for example, we want to run Terraform init and Terraform plan in order to check the changes that will be made by this template. So here we say we want only to check the infrastructure, the infra files, or the infra config. It won't deploy at this stage, but it is just checking the syntax of the files. Then during the release pipeline, those Terraform files or those ARM templates, they will be deployed into or they will be used in order to provision the infrastructure. So from here, we'll go to say the goal here is to deploy the infra config files. If they are using cloud, then they have a way to deploy those infrastructure onto the cloud in order to provision the different resources that needed in order to run my application. So this is the basics of the CI and CD pipelines. At the end, during the build or the CI pipeline, you want to compile the app, run some code, static code analysis, unit tests, deal with the SQL scripts and the infra config files. Then during the release, the goal is to deploy into the different environments we have. We talked about continuous integration and continuous deployment, but here we mentioned only the build and the release. So what is the difference? Here we say, if we say, for example, in each time I have a new git commit or git push to the source code management system, I want to trigger the build, then at that time this will be called the CI pipeline or for continuous integration. And each time I have a new change, I want to trigger the build pipeline. So from here I can say, for example, this could be called my CI pipeline. And if in each time I have a new build or a new CI pipeline that runs, then I want to run the release pipeline just after that, then here it will be called the CD pipeline for continuous deployment. And from here, to go from the source code management to trigger the build pipeline, we can define different strategies. So we can go to say, in each time I create a new commit or a new push to Git, I want to trigger the build. Or even better than this, I can trigger the build and each time I have a new pull request. Because when we develop the application, we don't want to use or to commit directly to the master branch, but rather than that, we want to create a dev branch. So here, let's say we have a master, and also then we'll have a dev branch. And for each developer will take a user story and he will develop that user story. So he will go to create another branch from dev or from master. So he will go to create a branch right here. He will develop the application commits only on his own branch. So this will be called the feature X branch. And at the end, when he finished committing or he finished developing his user story here, he will go to create a pull request onto the master or the dev branch depending on what you are doing. So let's say here, for example, he will commit and he will create the pull request onto the dev branch. So here, let's say this is gonna be a pull request. Then just at this time, we'll go to trigger the build pipeline and we can configure our CI/CD tools in order to take into account the pull requests. In DevOps, in addition to running the build and the release pipelines, we need to worry also about another thing, which is monitoring the application. So after releasing the app into those different environments, maybe we want to make sure we can monitor the application in order to be able to improve it. So from this step right here, we'll be able to see if the application is behaving as expected or not. So this loop could be configured using CI/CD tools. And here we can mention some of the most known tools. For example, Jenkins, which is the most known CI/CD tools. We have also Azure DevOps, the tool created by Microsoft. GitLab also, they have their own tool, GitLab CI, call it. We have some other tools like Circle CI, for example, GoCD, and many other tools that could be used to implement this CI/CD pipelines in order to create a process where the application's source code go through this process before going to the production environment, so that we make sure that everything is automated through using those different scripts. and also the will be more confident when we deploy the application. We don't need then we are not depending on the developers machines. So I hope this explanation was helpful for you, and thank you. No, that's not the end. If I didn't yet ask you to follow me on Twitter, on my handler is Usam Delai. That's the end. Thank you.